So we are very fortunate tonight to have Ray McGovern as our speaker. He is a long time Russia watcher. He began his career as a CIA analyst in the Nixon administration and carried that on into Reagan's term and George H.W. Bush. So he's had a lot of experience, and I'm very anxious to hear what he has to say to us this evening. So at this point, Ray, I'm going to let you go ahead and begin your talk. And you should be the speaker on the screen, and I think that should be fine for recording.
I just muted myself. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
You can?
I can.
Okay, good. Trying these new earbuds here so I can have, so I can wave around and gesticulate. Thanks for having me. And I hope we'll have a lot of questions. There certainly are questions galore about where we are now in Ukraine. Maybe I just say a little bit about, well, what passed for my credentials. Not only have I been watching Russia for half a century pretty closely, but I've been on the opposite end of the conventional wisdom for many, many years. Actually, I started my analytic duties at CIA under John Kennedy. And by the time I got around to briefing President Reagan's chief intelligence and other advisors in the early morning, then I had already had a little bit of gray in my beard to give me a little, what do they call it? Gravitas, right? So what I like to say is that after I retired, and I saw my friends, my former colleagues, deliberately falsifying intelligence to justify a completely unnecessary war. That was just too much. It was hard to believe. Matter of fact, after Bush had put hundreds of thousands of people in the field, I still couldn't possibly believe that America would start that kind of war. Well, in my view, it was bound to be, and it turned out to be one of the gravest mistakes in foreign policy the US ever made. Now, there's a difference between Iraq and I would say Afghanistan. And that difference is quite simply, was Iraq a threat to the United States? No way, unless you believed all the lies coming out from the statesmen, so to speak, and the mainstream media. It was incredible how the media just folded right in after it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction, not one, in Iraq. The head of the op-ed section of the Washington Post, what was his name now? It'll come to me in a second, but he was asked at the Columbia School of Journalism, Fred Hyatt, Mr. Hyatt, your op-ed pages for months before the attack on Iraq kept saying that weapons of mass destruction were a flat fact, that they were there. How do you account for that? And Hyatt said, well, you know, if they weren't there, we probably shouldn't have said that they were. Bob Perry, my mentor in journalism, commented that. He said, you know, yes, Ray, that's sort of a cardinal principle of journalism. If things are not there, you're not supposed to say that they are. Now, of course, they cashiered this guy right away, right? No, they let him stay on until he died this past year. 18 more years. Hello, does that tell you something? Last little vignette on this score. I was out in Detroit, and I had a friend of mine had an in with the Detroit Free Press, which was really quite a good newspaper in those days. And so I went to their editorial meeting this one day, and it happened to be the morning after David Kay, the chief inspector for finding weapons of mass destruction and leading the several $100 million worth of search for 2 years or whatever, he had said there aren't any. There are no weapons of mass. I can't find them because, not because Iraq is so large like Texas, but because they're not there. Now, why do I mention that? There was a disconnect. These editorial board members of a very reputable, good newspaper were unable to believe that everything they had said and other leading newspapers had said was bogus. And so they quizzed me, they drilled me. You know, I had been singing this song for over a year, so I knew what to tell them. And they were the only newspaper to confess, okay? They were the only newspaper to put in an editorial 3 days later, we were wrong, we were deceived, but we weren't the only one. And we suggest that other leading newspapers in this country fess up and say, we were deliberately lied to. How many newspapers do you know that did that? I only know of one, and that was the Detroit Free Press. So what I'm trying to say here is something, I guess, to say that we intelligence analysts that are kind of hidebound to the facts, okay, really can see things that the media will not point out to you. That went in spades for what we call Russiagate. Now, it's worth spending a minute on this because Russiagate prepared the way to facilitate the Hitler image that Putin has been given. After all, I mean, I don't know what you think of Trump. I think he was the worst president the United States ever had. But, you know, if you're going to blame something on somebody, I mean, what could be worse than being responsible for having Trump in office for 4 years? I mean, that's what comes down to, right? They were blaming Putin for that. And there wasn't a shred of evidence to that. The evidence was all just like the evidence for WMD concocted. Now, I've been saying that for 5 years as well. Bill Binney, one of our veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, who happened to have been technical director at the National Security Agency, NSA, put it out, and we published on December 12th, 2016, you know, right after the election, that it was impossible from a technical point of view that there could have been a Russian hack of those very damaging Democratic National Committee emails that showed pretty much that Hillary Clinton had stolen the nomination from Bernie Sanders. And that's what it came down to. You had to sort of reason to that. And now we have the head of the cyber firm that Robert Mueller had worked with for 10 years. And then the new FBI director had relied on to do the forensics on the DNC computers. He testified on December 5th, 2017, that, listen to this now, there is no technical evidence that anyone hacked into those DNC emails, not Russia, not anybody. That confirmed what we had said previous December, namely that it couldn't have been a hack. So what was it? It was sort of put a thumb drive in a machine and you copy. It was a copy. It was a leak. Somebody with access to the DNC computers downloaded or copied that data, put it in his or her pocket, and carried it over, I assume, to Europe, wherever WikiLeaks put it out. Now, there are many of you who probably don't know that the head of CrowdStrike, this cyber firm, has admitted that under oath, and that he did that on the 5th of December, 2017, right in the middle of Mueller's investigation. Did no one tell Mueller? Well, if you look at Mueller's report, no, he took what was said about CrowdStrike seriously, put it in his report. What's my point? Well, one reason we didn't know that the head of CrowdStrike, who said there couldn't have been a hack, is because Adam Schiff, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, came in and said, we're not disseminating, we're not letting that word get out. And so the testimony of December 5th, 2017 was kept under wraps until May 7th, 2020. Do the math. I think that's 2.5 years. Well, what happened on May 7th, 2020? Well, he was forced to release it, Schiff was, but I didn't see it in the New York Times, did you? Or did you see it in the Washington Post? So the New York Times is coming on its second year, May 7th, of suppressing this all important part of the equation on Russiagate, which shows that these were all manufactured by the people who wanted to first influence the election and then later make sure that Donald Trump could not be effective if he wanted to reach out to the Russians. The other thing, of course, is that we know now that there was one fable developed by computer nicks, but not very clever ones, that they allege that the Trump organization had ties with a bank in Russia. Okay, whoa. So and we have the emails now. I said, well, listen, people are going to see through this. This isn't strong enough. That's okay. We'll go with it anyway. Okay, they went with it anyway, and they lied about it. And so one of these fancy lawyers who worked for Hillary Clinton has now been indicted. His trial comes up in 3 weeks, and lots of information is being divulged about how this Russiagate was artificially invented and stoked and given to the American people to believe. People still believe that. I dare say if the New York Times released that sworn testimony by this fellow named Sean Henry, the head of CrowdStrike, it would be put on page 18 at the bottom, and people would still believe that. So what I'm saying is here that it wasn't very popular, especially among my liberal friends, that I would be saying the same kinds of things that Trump said. You know, a broken clock is correct. I think it's 2 times a day, right? Well, the fact that Trump said it didn't necessarily mean it was a lie. Most times you're right in assuming that, but this time, no, he's quite right. They tried to do him in, and they effectively did him in, have everybody believe. So what's the relevance here? The relevance here is that we have the same media, the same people in the media. David Sanger of the New York Times, for example, he wrote in July of 2002, right before the invasion the following March, 7 times that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in one article, 7 times in one article. So he was saying flat fact as well. So they're still doing it. Now, are they doing it with Ukraine? They're doing it to a fairly well. That's why I think we tried to put a title on this talk saying it's not what you've been led to believe. So where are we on Ukraine? Well, I hope that some of you have reviewed those links that were sent around, but let's do a very quick recapitulation of where we are. Now, I'll try to be brief here, but it's necessary to go back to 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. Wow. Eastern Europe was falling apart. George H.W. Bush, to his credit, called up Mikhail Gorbachev and said, Mikhail, sorry about all your troubles, but I assure you, I'm not going to dance on the Berlin Wall. His words, we're not going to take advantage of your problems in Eastern Europe. We need to meet because the place is falling apart. How soon can you meet me in a summit? And Gorbachev says, well, a couple of weeks. Okay, says Bush, meet me in Malta, first week of December. And that's what they did. And Bush told them, look, we're not going to take advantage of this, but you need to see my Secretary of State, James Baker. How soon can you see him? 4 weeks. Okay. 1st of February 2000, I'm sorry, 1st of February 1990 now, you have Baker arriving in Moscow. What is Baker? Baker's a slick Texas lawyer, right? He's an excellent Secretary of State, but that doesn't mean that he's above it, these kinds of tricks. So what does he say? He says, Mikhail, we got a deal for you. What we'd like is a reunited Germany. Now, when I heard that they were discussing a reunited Germany, I didn't want a reunited Germany. Maybe I watched too many war films when I was a boy. I lived through the war. I knew that NATO was set up to keep the US in, to keep Russia out, and to keep Germany divided. And so now I extrapolate from that, and I try to put myself in the position of Putin or Shevardnadze, his secretary, his foreign minister. Now they're Russian, right? Putin lost his big brother, siege of Leningrad. His father was wounded. His mother was left for dead, but luckily somebody heard her whimper. Russia lost 26 million citizens, Soviet citizens, during World War II. By comparison, the US had 400,000 combat troops killed. Now, that's a lot of troops. 400,000 is a lot. 26 million is a lot more. Where did the Nazis come through? Ukraine, one of the axes, okay. Where did Napoleon come to? Well, Ukraine. So, here they're being asked to say, well, wait a second, we're gonna reunite Germany. And so their answer was, well, all right, that's your quid, that's what you want. What's your quo? What's the quo that we'll get? And Baker said, well, how would it be? And I have this from Jack Matlock, Ambassador Matlock, who was there, okay. How would it be if we promised not to move any NATO troops, any NATO countries, 1 inch? That's about 2.5 centimeters, Mikhail, closer to Russia. Wow. Okay, the place was falling apart. Gorbachev and Shevardnadze were in real need of US economic aid. I said, well, we'll cut this deal. Okay, you promise, right? Cross my heart and hope to die, says James Baker. Now, my father was a lawyer. He always used to say, Ray, get it in writing, right? Now, James Baker's a lawyer, a real slick lawyer. And since Gorbachev and Shevardnadze didn't have the presence of mind to say, hey, we need that in writing, they didn't get it in writing. So when Bill Clinton came in, 1996, 1997, he said, show me that promise in writing. It wasn't in writing. And so Bill Clinton said, well, easy. We'll just let Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic, let them in. And everybody said, well, we promised not to. Jack Matlock testified before the Congressional Committee, said, no, we promised not to. This is going to lead to all kinds of problems if you let these guys in. But then Jack was told after he testified, look, Clinton's already decided that he needs the Czech, the Polish, the Hungarian vote in the Midwest to beat Bob Dole. So it's a done deal. Doesn't matter if you think it's strategically crazy, forget about it, roll with the punches. Matlock, you said that. He's actually written that. And so, long story short, we went back on our promise not to move NATO 1 inch to the east of the East German border at the time. Now count them up, 14, 14 new nations in NATO since that promise. So let's fast forward now to 2008. What happened? Well, people are talking about adding Ukraine and Georgia, the country of Georgia in the Caucasus, to NATO. Now, at this time, Putin had pretty much started rebuilding the Russian military, trying to be a little bit more assertive. And so he told his foreign minister, then as now, Sergei Lavrov, said, you call the US ambassador in and tell him, "Niet." Niet for what? Niet. You don't let Ukraine into NATO. So that's what happens. Now, I have to tell you that we have a Moscow cable that spells all this out, because it's the cable from the US ambassador in Moscow at the time. His name was William Burns, okay? Right now he's the head of CIA of all places. Anyhow, he's called in by Lavrov, and Lavrov says, "Mr. Burns, do you know what niet means?" Oh, yeah, well, niet means niet. You don't let Ukraine or Georgia into NATO, because if that happens, we will have to decide whether we have to invade. Then we have to decide what we do about a civil war that will inevitably arise. We don't want to face that. We have geopolitical interests here. Niet means niet. Now, how do I know all this? It's from a Moscow cable, as I think I said. How do we get the Moscow cable? From Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, okay? It's just one gem that is in that all that take from Julian Assange. How do I know it's authentic? Well, if I've seen one Moscow cable from the embassy in Moscow, I've seen about 5,000 over my career. So there you have, and to his credit, Ambassador Burns at the time played it straight. He said to Condoleezza Rice, who is Secretary of State at the time, he said, look, you know, Russia does have its own strategic concerns. I mean, it's reasonable to think that they are, you know, genuinely concerned about their, you know, blah, 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 blah. Well, ambassadors usually don't go that far against the tide. So Bill Burns did. And what did Condoleezza Rice do? Well, she talked to Dick Cheney and she talked to George Bush, as she normally did. And they said, screw the Russians. At the next NATO meeting, let's vote, let's pressure everyone to admit them into NATO, Ukraine and Georgia. So that was February 1st, 1990, okay? On April 3rd, 1990, so 2 months later, in Bucharest at a NATO summit, the declaration said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, okay? So that's 2008. What did the Russians do about it? Well, they knew enough about how the French and Germans really felt about Ukraine and Georgia coming into NATO. They knew that was not going to happen anytime soon, okay? So let's fast forward from 2008 to more recent times. Okay, well, let's talk about what Biden did when he came in, because that will get us up to date. Well, the first thing he did, which was relevant to Russia, was let himself be snookered into answering a question from George Stephanopoulos, who's one of the real, well, I'll talk about that later. Stephanopoulos says, Mr. President, do you think Putin's a killer? And by the, yeah, I think he's a killer, yep. Yep. Now I remember that was March the 17th. I remember that because it was St. Patrick's Day, helped to mnemonic there, okay? So what happened next? Well, next week, uh, Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken go out to Anchorage to meet their Chinese counterparts, and they talk to them as though they were the British imperialists the Chinese have such a sad history dealing with, okay? They talk down to them. It was so bad that the Chinese foreign minister said, look, you don't have the qualifications to talk to us stuff like that. So the two sort of major insults at pretty much the same time. What happens? Well, I'll look at a note here so that I can make sure. Yeah, okay. So now we're talking the end of March last year. Now on the 24th of March, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, says out of the blue, we're going to take back Crimea. We're going to take back the eastern provinces. And, if it comes to having a war about that, yeah, we're good for that. We're good for the battle, okay? He made that the policy of the Ukrainian government. What happens the next day? March 25th, the Russians send tens of thousands of troops to the border area near Ukraine, okay? So that's March 18th, all this at the end of March, so a year ago. Next thing you know, President Biden gets a little upset about what Zelensky has said and how the Russians have reacted. And so he calls up Putin. And he says, well, how many troops do you have there along the border? And Putin says, well, our defense minister just announced yesterday that there are 2 full armies and 3 airborne associated units. That's a lot. And Biden says, yeah, that's a lot. And Putin says, maybe you ought to turn back those warships that are on their way through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea. We don't want any trouble. Biden says, turn those ships around, have them visit Greece. And that's what they do. Then Biden says, hey, let's have a summit to discuss all this. And Putin says, okay, sure. All right. So on the 16th of June, if you fast forward now, they have this summit. And it didn't go really well. And one of the reasons it didn't go really well was because Biden, as he indicated before they could hustle him onto the plane, he said, he told the press, it's not really appropriate for me to say what I'm going to say, but Putin has a major problem, and it's China. They're squeezing the Russians. Biden's word, squeezing Russia. They have this long, long border, and China, of course, wants to be the paramount military presence there in Asia. The Russians are awful. They have a real serious problem with China. Now, I would have loved to have been with Putin and his advisors when Putin turned to them and says, where does Biden get the idea that China and Russia are each other's throats? That was the case 5 decades ago. Are these young advisors that he had, are they reading out of a textbook that goes back 5 decades? We have to show this president that China and we, Russia, are really allied now. And that far from we having a problem with China, China is going to support us in whatever else we do. So what happens? They do all kinds of PR things, including a direct telephone call between Putin and Xi, the president of China, in which they show that they're very solid in their mutual aims. Xi comments, well, this is the 27th meeting we've had, either virtual or in person, since 2013. So they went out of their way to show that China and Russia are united in facing down what they consider to be the common threat from US. So where does this get us now? Well, when when Putin and Xi were on the telephone, it was the middle of December, Putin said, look, I'm coming to the Olympics. I'd be delighted to help you feature the opening, and I'm looking forward to it. And Xi said, you're most welcome. So Putin was up there on the 4th of February when the Olympics started. Now, right before that, in the 8 or 9 weeks before that, there was this back and forth about, well, you know, meeting Russia's security concerns. Could they work out a deal so that Russia wouldn't be so afraid of what the US and NATO were doing right on its long border with Ukraine? And so Putin had a chance to discuss this with Xi. Now, this is speculation with respect to exactly how it went down, but I think in retrospect, this is the way it happened. Putin says to Xi, look, best friend Xi, NATO and the Americans are not taking us seriously. We have information that whatever they promise is not going to last. You know, new president comes in, reverses everything. So we're going to have to take care of the Nazis. We're going to have to take care of the very highly militarized and now trained by NATO forces in Ukraine. And this is the point we're going to have to do it before they attack us. We have information that they're arrayed against Donetsk and Lugansk, and ready to strike, say, in early March. So we may have to go and invade Ukraine. Xi. You mean after the Olympics, right? Putin. Yes, after the Olympics. Now, that's big, okay? Myself and all my Chinese analyst friends said Xi would never approve that. China has this fundamental foreign policy principle stand against interference in the affairs of other countries. That would never square with that. Well, guess what? In my view, Xi gave Putin an exemption, okay? He kind of said, and he has said 2 times now to EU leaders and to others, he said, hey, to Biden, he said, look, we judge things on the facts on the ground, whatever each specific circumstances is. No, he didn't say this, but usually they said, no, that's a principle stand. We're against interference in any other country. So the way I see this going down is that Xi himself threatened by China. I mean, Xi himself threatened by the US. I don't know if you know this, but the Defense Department has come out with its every 4-year national strategy document. And guess who's enemy number 1? China. Guess who doesn't even make it to the top 4 enemies? Russia. So they've trained their sights on China, and Xi has read that document, I'm sure. And so it's kind of a deal where he knows that if Russia falters in the West, you know, he's in for it. He's next in line. Let's put it that way. So what do we have right now? And I'll stop speaking and hope for good questions. Right now, we've got a very, very dangerous situation. Russia has said that it's going to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Now, the Nazis are in Mariupol. That's the whole deal about Mariupol. the Azov Battalion and many of the Nazi-led and Nazi-populated units are kind of are encircled down there in Mariupol. Now the Russians can just bomb them now, or they can wait until they come out. One of the reasons why it's very delicate is that as they come out, you may see some contractors from Western Europe or from the United States advising, in some cases, perhaps even leading some of these Nazi battalions. That's going to be very, very, very embarrassing. So what's going on now is the US is trying to appear very strong. Biden has been told, look, Democrats are going to really take it on the nose in November unless you appear strong. And everybody, especially the media, is sort of saying, well, you can't just let the Russians win. Well, here's the bottom line. The Russians have to win. For Russia, what's been going on in Ukraine is an existential threat. And as I mentioned, the Russians told us this back on February 1st, 2008. We have the cable. Now, Russia is a far cry from the state of its armed forces then. Now it's very well prepared, very well armed with missiles that are even more sophisticated than our own. Some of you probably, like me, know what Mach 1 is, speed of sound. Would you believe some of these go at Mach 8, Mach 9? They do, okay? And the US is a little bit behind in such missilery. What I'm saying is this, that Putin, and it looks like he's got 80% approval rating so far. It looks like he's got an existential threat that he sees, and so for him, it's a must win. Now, how about the US? Well, I mean, I mentioned Iraq before. Did the US have a existential threat there? No. Did it win? No. Was that a big deal? No. If you don't have an existential threat, you don't have to win. To be very blunt about it. So what's going to happen here is that the US has really got to kind of backtrack and figure out what it really wants to do. Because sending $800 million worth of arms into Ukraine only to have them blown up by the Russians as soon as they cross the border for the ones that the Russian intelligence can decipher. The ones in the trunks of cars, they probably won't, but they won't amount to much. So what's going to happen when it becomes widely known, that all these taxpayer dollars going into $800 million more, there are $3 billion all told, arms worth going to Ukraine, get blown up. Well, that's not going to look strong. I mean, that's not going to look strong at all. What happens when the next Boris Johnson wants to visit Kiev and appear and be interviewed? Well, if there are bombs going off all around them, that's not going to appear very good either. What I'm saying here is this. The US continues to pour in all this information, all these weaponry. And the Russians said, they spent all last week saying this, we're going to destroy it if you put it in there. Well, they didn't. They said unintended consequences. I mean, really clear as a bell what the consequences are going to be. And they started doing it yesterday. So what's the dilemma is the US and NATO don't need to win this one, in my view. They only need to win this one if you accept the sophomoric view that Putin wants to take over all of Europe. No, I'm not kidding. This was a view espoused by Fiona Hill, the go-to lady for looking at what Russia is all about. She studied under, what's his name, one of these Polish troglodytes. Anyhow, she says, yep, that's what Putin's aim is, to chase the US out of Europe. And as she delicately put it, not let the door hit his backside as he leaves, not let NATO's door or US door hit their backside as they leave. Well, there is no evidence. And John Mearsheimer, who knows a lot more about foreign relations than I do, agrees. There's no evidence that Putin wants to take over the rest of the world. The Soviet Union imploded. There's no evidence that Putin wants to take over Germany or France or any part of Western Europe. That's passé. There's no evidence for that. So unless the US wants to back Putin in the kind of corner where he has to think about, not just talk about, using nuclear weapons. And I do give Biden credit for doing everything he can to foreclose the option of World War III here, or destroying all the rest of us. So well, let's put it this way: if Putin can face down these pressures, and the midterms are really important to the Dems. The Dems don't want to look weak. Unless he can face down these pressures, which come from everybody except, ironically, the Pentagon. The Pentagon knows which end is up here. They know that China and Russia are pretty much united in the military alliance now. And so, bottom line here, Putin has to win. If he's driven into a corner where it looks like he can't win, what's going to happen? China, like the cavalry, to the rescue. Now, they don't have to pour troops into Ukraine, for God's sake. They can just do a little dust up right there in the South China Sea, or across from Taiwan. And our US Navy would be delighted, because that means they'll get more money for build twice as many ships. But it's going to worry the planners that have to say, oh, wait a second now, are we ready for a two-front war? And that's why the Pentagon has been much more reluctant, much more judicious in facing up to this threat. So I'll leave it there. I've talked long enough, probably too long, and there are lots of questions that come up. I hardly know all the answers, but I'll give you my opinion for when I don't know the answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. That's very interesting. And I know there will be questions. So those of you out there who have a question, just raise your hand from the, and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, I put one in the chat. I wanted, you mentioned a lot of Nazis in Mariupol, and I wonder what the definition of Nazi is. Because a lot of people think that it's anti-Semitism, but I'm not sure that's the case.
Well, all I would say is that these are people who take as their banner patriot Stepan Bandera, who cooperated with the Nazis. Actually, he fought under the Nazis during World War II. These are people who really liquidated many Poles, many Hungarians, many Ukrainians at the behest of Hitler. That's because they hated the Russians more than they hated the Germans. Now, their direct descendants who use swastikas on their flags and who, Sieg Heil sort of salute, it's well known that they're leading. They were the spearhead of the revolution, let's call it a revolution, it was a coup d'etat on the Maidan in Kiev on February 22nd, 2014. They led that. Now, who trained them? Well, Western intelligence services trained and equipped them. We know that. They were shooting at the police as well as the demonstrators on the Maidan. And it was, it was a deliberate provocation to have the coup. When the new government was formed, there were Nazis in prominent positions in the security services and so forth. When Zelensky was elected president, he had hopes of tamping down tensions with Russia. In fact, most people think that's largely why he won. So he went out to the Donetsk and Lugansk, where Nazi formation, we say neo-Nazis. Okay, let's say neo-Nazis, maybe that's a little better. Okay, they're out there. And he says to them, look, could you ease off on the shelling? We've already had 14,000 people killed. Could you ease off a little? And they looked at him and said, well, who the hell are you? I said, well, I'm the president. I'm the president. And I'm ordering you. And say, get out of here. Now, that's how much power Zelensky has over these folks who really have been wreaking havoc against Russian speakers, many of them Russian citizens in Donetsk and Lugansk. And that was part, I believe, of the motivation where Putin and his advisors said, look, if we don't stop this carnage, and if as we think the Ukrainians are about to go in there and take over Donetsk and Lugansk, if we don't do it now, when will we ever do it? So 8 years is a long time, 14,000 casualties is a lot of time. And the business about Zelensky being of Jewish descent, well, that's just a really good talking point, but he's not his own man. He answers he has to answer to the Nazis as well as to the United States.
What do you think the chances of a negotiated settlement are? What can the United States, you heard people talk about the United States and China getting together to do a negotiated settlement. What kind of things need to happen for that to take place?
Yeah. Well, I don't think the Chinese are going to be able to play any kind of middleman role. I may be wrong on that, but since they've thrown their support right behind Russia, it doesn't seem like anyone would want to deal with the Chinese as an interlocutor. What needs to happen, what I dearly hope happens, is a ceasefire as soon as possible. But the way things are going, it looks like the Russians mean to do their thing there in the southern part, there in the Mariupol, where they have encircled most of these Ukrainian and many of them Nazi-led units. This rings a bell. The Nazis did come through Ukraine. The Nazis did kill 26 million Soviet citizens. And so when Russians see atrocities caused by these, the regiment there, the folks that actually became part of the government, the right sector, the Azov battalion, that gets publicized in Russia. And there's a good deal of internal support for cleaning them out now so that they don't kill 14,000 more Russian speakers or Russian citizens in Donetsk and Lugansk.
Okay.
Oh, Joe, I guess I didn't really answer your question. What needs to happen also is that a recognition that Ukraine could become neutral. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Zelensky said, okay, we don't have to join NATO. He may have even said, we could remain neutral. Well, that's a big concession. That means not a member of NATO. So what happened? well, nobody seemed to think that was good enough. And in my view, he's faced a lot of pressure, not only from the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, but also from Washington. There's every reason to suspect that Washington is prepared to let this go, fighting off to the last Ukrainian. They're shipping in more arms. Is that a way to get a negotiated settlement? I don't think so. Biden is calling Putin every name in the book. Is that a way to get negotiated? No, I don't think so. So, by all appearances, the U.S. trying to appear strong and sending in all our taxpayer-paid munitions is really waiting to see how the thing evolves. And not only that, but people like Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is saying openly that our objective is to weaken Russia, to make sure that Russia is not a big player. Now, the sanctions hurt. They hurt everybody. I mean, they're hurting people right here. They'll hurt China a little bit, but the Russians are kind of used to dealing with sanctions now, and they're making all kinds of arrangements. And I'm not an economist, but I will say this. I'll say that I have no more confidence in the economists advising Biden than I do in the Jake Sullivans and the Tony Blinkens and the other sophomores who have very little experience and operate out of a imperialist kind of hubris. When I was watching Sino-Soviet relations, they used to call each other imperialists, but they also call each other great power chauvinists. Okay. Well, if you look at some of the rhetoric coming out of Washington, people still think that the US is exceptional, that it's indispensable. And that's great power chauvinism. And the ironic thing is that was true once upon a time, after World War II, and even after 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell down. It's not true any longer. Worse still, from the US point of view, you have the other two major powers, Russia and China, and you have countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, lots of people. And their distinctive mark, by the way, is they don't look like us. Now, Russians have been so blackened that they don't look like us either by now. But what I'm trying to say here is that racism plays a real role, in my view, and that it's much easier to take on people of color, as we have you count on Vietnam, Afghanistan, or whatever. It's much easier to do that. And it's much harder to take in refugees from these countries. Look what's happening in Ukraine. They're being welcomed with open arms by Poland. Poland wouldn't take one Syrian, for God's sake. So racism is playing a role here. And as long as our policymakers, some of them very ivy clad in their outlooks, consider themselves to be above others, we're in for a real shocking realization that that's no longer the case. And to proceed on those assumptions is going to get us a very bloody nose at the hands not only of Russia, but of China.
Here's another question from
I guess I'd like to
wanting to know that why is it that there's so little accurate detail in U.S. media sources other than, say, Democracy Now!, for instance?
Well, the media is controlled by the rest of what I call the Mickey Mat. Now, I know some of you have heard me say this before, but Eisenhower, of course, warned about the accretion of influence by the hands of the MIC, the military-industrial complex. Right now, today, we have something much more involved. It's developed like Topsy. Okay, now it's the Mickey Mat. It's the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Now, why did I say media? Because media is the linchpin. Doesn't work without the media. Who owns the media? The rest of the Mickey Mouse, okay? So media is part of this profiteering on war. We have Raytheon and Lockheed sending letters out to their shareholders a couple of months ago saying, uptick in tensions in Ukraine, very good for business. Who makes Raytheon? Who makes the those missiles called after the Indian? What's his name? Well, anyhow, Raytheon makes the missiles, and Lockheed makes just about everything else. Boeing, they're all in it, and they're all profiteering on this. And so, in short, the media being controlled by these same corporations is only going to give you one side of the story. That's why probably some of the things I've said tonight have been offensive to you because they're so new, but I'd like to be able to support them with evidence if you ask me some questions.
Okay, is there anyone else have a question?
Yes, I have a question. I put in the chat as well. I guess that media and other sources, we know this about oligarchs, how bad they are, and I bet they are too. And they made their money early on in the 90s, looting the Soviet, I guess the whatever left over from the Soviet Union, Russia. But what I don't understand is these guys don't live even in Russia, and they have $600 billion yachts and $100 million mansions and the soccer clubs and all that. I guess I don't understand how they are helping Putin, and how do Russian people view them. It's kind of I don't know, enigma for me. Do you have some
Well,
light on that?
I think we have to put this in context. You know, there are Russian oligarchs, there are American oligarchs, there are British oligarchs. When the Soviet Union imploded, 1990, 1991, the Wall Street boys, for example, flooded into Moscow. Those enterprises were sought. They were milked for all they were worth. And it was with the cooperation, of course, of those oligarchs that knew their way around in Russia. How did the Russian people endure all that? Well, you know, between 1991 and 1995, the life expectancy of a Russian male went down from 61 years old to 55. Think about that. What, 4 years? They were starving. They were broke. And the Russian people looked at these oligarchs and saw Yeltsin. When Yeltsin went up for re-election in 1996, he would have surely lost were we not to have come to his aid. The same Wall Street guys, same IMF pumping money into, it's widely acknowledged. As a matter of fact, Yeltsin appeared on the cover of Time with all kinds of US dollars pouring into him. He won 1996, and more of that same kind of thing happened. So here's Putin comes in after Yeltsin sort of peters out, having drunk himself to death. And he inherits a shambles. And he watched this happen. And so what does he do? Well, he works with those oligarchs that are willing to be influenced by the central government. And he makes it very, very difficult for the other ones to hang around. Those are the ones that go to London, those ones that go to the Cayman Islands, okay? So oligarchs, you know, oligarchs, everybody's got oligarchs. What the oligarchs did to Russia in the 1990s under Yeltsin was a scandal. And it's the kind of thing that Russians remember, and Putin himself remembers, having been in a fairly prominent position in Petersburg during some of those years. And then I don't know why Yeltsin appointed Putin as his successor. Maybe it was an act of contrition. Maybe he said, I've ruined this country. Here's the one guy that I think can put it back on its feet. But he did name him. And I have to tell you that Putin did rebuild the society, rebuilt the army. And those people who say that Putin wants to take over the rest of the world, or maybe just the rest of Western Europe, I don't know. I just don't know what evidence they cite for that. And so the bottom line really is, in my view, if Russia is not expansionist, and not only I, but John Mearsheimer and others say there's not an iota of evidence that Russia wants to expand. They got enough problems in country. So if it's not expansionist, what kind of threat does it raise? Well, it raises a big threat if you can maintain this image of a threat to the Mickey man. In other words, if Russia goes away, if we have a rapprochement with Russia, as we did back in the 70s and 80s when I was still around on active duty, well, what happens to the enemy that we have to build all these arms against? Suppose we have another arms accord. My God, that'll be poison for those who are profiteering on building systems like the ABM system, which we knew from the get-go, and I'm talking 1982, would never work, could always be decoyed or kind of vitiated. So, a lot of people making a lot of money on tension. One problem is that a lot of them are so green behind the ears or so young that they don't know what nuclear war would mean. And so they're willing to take it right up to the nuclear threshold, hoping that Putin, bluffing, or as the White House spokesperson said today, he's making meaningless threats. Well, I have to tell you that those $800 million worth of weaponry that's going into Ukraine are going to be destroyed by Russian air power and all other kinds of power. That's not a meaningless threat. And as long as people think and say these kinds of things, that of course strengthens those people in Moscow who say, just can't deal with these people anymore. All they know is force. We'll clean up what we need to do in Ukraine, get it denazified, get it demilitarized, make sure that this stuff doesn't happen again, and then work out some broader European security arrangement where our interests are also included in what people plan in terms of war.
Joe, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, this is Elizabeth Axtell here in Raleigh. We all know that the first
Elizabeth, could you speak a little softer or step back from the mic?
okay. We all know that the first casualty in war is the truth. And there's a lot of propaganda being flung around. And right now, I would say that our country is experiencing war fever. And especially even among relatives of mine, all they can talk about is how horrible Putin is, how horrible Russia is, blah, 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 blah. And so how do we reduce the war fever in this country so that perhaps we can get a ceasefire in Ukraine and get negotiations to bring this conflict to an end?
Well, Elizabeth, thanks for the question. I wish I knew. It's very difficult to break into the mainstream media. We have to keep trying. Another thing that I have in mind is we have to get out and put our bodies into it in whatever way that we think we can do that. Used to be that we could get out and demonstrate or visit our Congress people. Hopefully the COVID scare will diminish and we'll be able to do more of that. But unless people see how acute the problem is, unless people see that we've been sold a bill of goods just as we were before Iraq, just as we were during Russiagate, unless they can see that, then it's hard for them to act. We have been trying to. We got some initial press when we opposed the war in Iraq for being not grounded in any reality that is evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Ex post facto, we'll be able to say, well, this was a bunch of lies, but ex post facto doesn't count. The risks are very, very, very high this time. The more so since something I didn't mention, but should be of interest. Ted Postal, who is a MIT professor of physics and who is the chief intelligence advisor for the chief of naval operations in the Pentagon. He has found that Russia's early warning system of incoming attack is woefully deficient. It's about a quarter as good as ours. Now, let me explain to the degree I can. We have these really sophisticated satellites. This is no classified thing. It's well known that our satellites cover the world. Any ballistic missile that's fired, whether it's on the sea, under the sea, on land, we see it immediately, okay? Not so the Russians. And Ted likes to cite a case study where a rocket went up from the northern part of Norway. It was a research rocket. They want to find out something about the Milky Way or something, right? But no one told the Russians. And as it vectored into the space where the Russians are looking right down at North Dakota and where all our missiles are, there was a threat that was incoming, okay? That could have been the beginning of a nuclear attack on Russia. So Ted explains that these generals and admirals, they're in the situation room. They don't know what to make of this. And they say, well, check on the ICBMs. They checked on the ICBMs. No particular activity at the ICBM fields in North Dakota, Colorado, well, Montana, okay? Whew. Well, how about the North Atlantic? Well, sir, we can't cover the North Atlantic. What? That's the reality, folks. The Russians can't know if we send off these Trident, these missiles on the Trident submarines. They don't have coverage of the seas. So what am I talking about now? I'm talking about back in the day, in my day, let's say the 70s, 80s, there would be about 35 minutes of warning time from launch to target. So a President Putin now or President Biden would have half of that at least, if it was verified, to decide what to do, whether they should destroy the rest of the world at the same time or not. Now it's not that way. And the danger that Putin has spoken about for 7 years now, these sites that are going into Poland and Romania, the one in Romania is finished, the ones in Poland is being finished. They're described as anti-ballistic missile sites, but all you have to do is put a CD in their computer and they turn out to be able to fire Tomahawk missiles. That's the Indian word I was searching for before. Putin calls them Tomahawk. Tomahawk missiles. There's no H in Russian, okay? So Tomahawk missiles in those sites, which can be done overnight by a new CD, okay? They can hit Moscow and they can hit the ICBM force in the western part of Russia in about 6 or 7 minutes. And if these same sites are equipped with hypersonic missiles, it's like 4 to 5 minutes. Now, that's not enough. That's not enough for Putin to decide whether to destroy the rest of the world. So he's got a legitimate concern there. And he knows that these ABM sites set up ostensibly to guard against ICBMs from Iran, who not only didn't have any missiles that long or nuclear warheads put on them. So he knows that that was a lie, that's why they were constructed. So the ABM treaty, George Bush destroyed. The Intermediate Forces Treaty, Trump got rid of that one. So the Russians are facing this existential, and I say that again, existential threat from a NATO and the United States that doesn't take their security concerns seriously. And were those sites to be peopled by different missiles, Tomahawk missiles, or these hypersonic missiles, there's no warning time. So what's the result? Well, you know what the result is, don't you? They automate the process. Automate it, okay? So next time you have a research scientific missile going up northern Norway, well, do subordinate units now have the authorization to press the nuclear button? Well, the alternative is be too late for Putin to push it. Now, I don't know what the real situation is, but that is really, really dangerous. The circumstances that I described are real. And Ted Postal and other people who know a lot more about the missilery and the launching and the coverage by our satellites and the lack of coverage by Russian satellites. So, you know, what we're talking about here is existential threats. And last thing I'll say on this is that, you know, if there's a nuclear exchange, well, Dan Ellsberg, you really ought to read Dan Ellsberg's book on the doomsday machine. He explains the whole thing, okay? Now, the other thing is, and this I'll leave with you, economists talk about opportunity costs. You know, you build one aircraft and you could have built schools for a whole state for what that aircraft costs. Okay, now the mother of all opportunity costs, get this, the mother of all opportunity costs is Ukraine. The reason I say that is that we don't have a lot of time to deal with global warming. All our attention is diverted from that now. The Chinese are digging more coal than before. The US military is the greatest provider, the worst provider of those fumes that go up and destroy our stratosphere. So the mother of all opportunity costs is what Ukraine has really done to the longer term. And you don't have to have 10 grandchildren, as we do, to worry a little bit about what happens to the next generation and then the generation after that. If these wars and other things that aggravate the situation not ended quickly.
Thank you for that. Doug, I believe Doug Ryder has a question.
Doug is my superior in Veteran for Peace.
He said there was a question in the chat and I don't see it, so I don't know if you're muted, Doug. I don't hear anything from him. So any other questions that we haven't covered here?
This is Ann Casabon. I had one in the chat.
Okay.
First, let me thank you, Ray. This has been really good. And I think your last point about opportunity costs, it may be a basic point, but you put it very powerfully. So thank you. This is in a way less important than that, but I would love it if you would backtrack to 2014 in Ukraine. And I'd like to hear your comments on that and your comments on the Minsk agreements.
Thanks, Ann. I sort of glided over that, and it deserved more attention. Okay, you know, I'm going to go back to 2013 because this gave a real push to the putsch that happened in 2014. What I mean is this. The neocons who are back now helping Biden run foreign policy wanted to have a war in Syria. And so what happened was there was a false flag chemical attack outside of Damascus, which they blamed on Bashar al-Assad. That was on the 21st of August, 2013. John Kerry got up a week later and said, Bashar al-Assad did it. He said that 35 times in one speech. Did Bashar al-Assad do it? No, he didn't. The head of national intelligence visited President Obama at the same time and said, no, Mr. Obama, Mr. President, I know that John Kerry is a real terrific fella and that he could drive boats up the Mekong, but he's not a real good strategic planner. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Our evidence is, what should we say? It's not a slam dunk. It's not a slam dunk that Bashar al-Assad did this. Now, the illusion, of course, is George Tenet, the previous head of intelligence, telling President Bush and Cheney that the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a slam dunk. So here's Clapper, the director of national intelligence, in the last week of August 2013, telling Obama, look, Kerry's a great guy, and I don't want to, but he's misinformed. We can't give you an intelligence estimate. And so they put out a government estimate, which means that it was done by hacks in the White House. Now, at the same time, Obama was going to St. Petersburg for an economic summit, group of 8, I think, at the time. And so he met with Putin. And Putin said, Mr. President, I have a way out of your problem. I know everybody wants to make an open war against Syria, John Kerry especially, but he's not with you here. Let me just tell you, we've persuaded the Syrians to destroy all their chemical weapons on a US ship outfitted for such destruction under UN supervision. That would avoid your problem. You wouldn't have to make a war on Syria. What do you think? Well, Obama didn't have to think very long. He said, man, that'd be great. Okay. Now, while Kerry kept pushing for a war against Syria, Obama came back and said, look, John Kerry, you go out. We're not going to go to war with Syria. Work out this deal at Geneva. And long story short, those Syrian chemical weapons were destroyed under UN supervision on a US warship. Okay. Now, Putin wrote an op-ed on September 11, 2013. And he said, I'm really, really happy at the growth of mutual trust, not only between our countries, but between Mr. Obama and me personally. I hope it will grow. We've avoided a war. The only thing I object to is the notion that one country is more exceptional than the others, okay? So that was a New York Times op-ed written by Putin, okay? So growth of trust, that's verboten. you can't have growth of trust and make a lot of money for Raytheon and for Lockheed. That's for the birds. Okay, so what happens? The people in the State Department, Victoria Nuland and the others, tell the CIA guys and all to train up those rightists, those neo-Nazis in Poland and elsewhere, and we're going to have a putsch. We're going to have a putsch on the middle of Kiev, and we're going to change the government because the government there now under Yanukovych is a little bit too pro-Russian, and so that's what they do. 6 months after the growth of trust, they do a coup in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, on the 22nd of February, 2014. Now, why is that coup appropriately called the most blatant coup in history? I hope some of you read those links that were sent around before, because the intercepted conversation between our Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, and our ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Pyatt, they're plotting the coup. They're saying who will be the next prime minister, Yats for Yatsenyuk. They're saying, the EU doesn't like it, F the EU. They're saying, we need some international personage to solidify this. Jake Sullivan, who works for Vice President Biden, says Biden is good to come in and make this thing stick. Okay. Now, what's extraordinary about that? Two things. Number one, they said that en clair, no encryption in this telephone conversation. Somebody intercepted it. And number two, it was put on YouTube. Oh, when was it put on YouTube? On the 4th of February, 2014. Oh, 4th of February. Well, you said the coup was the 22nd, but that was blown. Yeah, it was blown. When I heard that thing on YouTube, I said, well, poor Yatsenyuk, he'll never be prime minister of Ukraine. And my God, Victoria Nuland using that language, F the EU. One reason we know it's authentic is because Nuland apologized 2 days later, not for the coup, but for saying F the EU. Okay, so long story short, 18 days, if my arithmetic is good, 18 days before the coup, it was advertised on YouTube. Now, what happened? Well, the coup plotters were able to dislodge those people who were loyal to the government. And by the time Putin, I guess Putin thought the same thing I did. The coup is blown. Too bad for Yatsenyuk. I can stay in Sochi and finish up these Winter Olympics. They didn't come back until the day later, the 23rd of February 2014. Now, what did he do? Oh my God. The new prime minister of Ukraine said that he'd like Ukraine to join, guess what? Join NATO. He'd like to ban Russian as an official language in Ukraine. He said this right away. So Putin's with his advisors there, his military advisors. What do you do about this? Can we countenance a Ukraine in NATO? And the answer was, niet, 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 niet. Okay. Now, what's our most important equity here? Well, obviously, our sole warm water port for our Navy that happens to be in Crimea, a place called Sevastopol. It's been there since Catherine the Great, the time of our revolution, okay? We've got to make sure that NATO doesn't seize Sevastopol. And so that's when they said, well, what are we going to do about Crimea? And somebody said, well, it's an accident of history that Crimea is part of Ukraine. Khrushchev just sort of out of a whim gave Crimea to Ukraine back in 1954. Let's find out how the Crimeans look at this. So they had a plebiscite. The plebiscite was over 90% rejoin Russia. because they're mostly Russians there, mostly Russian speakers. So it was a no-brainer. And a month later, Putin commented that, yep, this is what the people in Crimea wanted. And besides, he said, you know, I just as soon, if NATO wants to visit Sevastopol, the Navy yard there, I'd like it to be the same way it is now, where they would forward a request to Moscow and we would say, sure, you're welcome to come. I wouldn't like it to be, I know these NATO guys are great fellows, says Putin, but I wouldn't want to have to ask them to visit the NATO port in Sevastopol. So what happened was, that was the thing that started this whole business. That was the thing that prompted Putin to annex Crimea. Am I in favor of countries annexing? No, I'm not. Do I understand why Putin did it? I certainly do. And the people in the Russian-speaking provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk in the east part of Ukraine, they didn't want any part of the coup government, banning Russian as an official language and all kinds of other indignities that the people there in the coup regime were doing on pro-Russians and Russians. So they decided that they would resist the encroachment of the coup regime. And so they declared their independence. And they went to Putin and said, oh, please annex us. We want to be annexed. Well, you did Crimea, please annex us. And Putin, nothing doing. Crimea was a special thing. I mean, look, only all year round naval base was there. You guys work it out. And we'll give you some support. And the Russians did, you know, some arms and some fighters, I imagine. But that's the way it evolved. Now, I'm glad you mentioned the Minsk protocols, because we're talking 2014, February. What happened was the Ukrainian army, such as it was, geared itself up and went out to take back Donetsk and Lugansk. They were fought to a standstill. It was really, really bloody. Most of those 14,000 people killed were killed then, okay? And people with more sense said, well, let's stop this. And the Germans and the French and the Polish at the time put the strong arm around the Ukrainian sides and said, look, stop the fighting. We'll have a ceasefire and then we'll talk. And part of the deal will be that Donetsk and Lugansk will have a measure of autonomy within the Ukrainian state, that will be written into the Constitution. Now, that never happened. And Zelensky had said it was going to happen, but he was not allowed to let it happen if indeed he wanted it to happen. Not allowed by the neo-Nazis, not allowed, I suspect, by the United States. So the Minsk Accords, as much as they tried to tamp down the situation and were endorsed at the highest level of the United Nations, mind you, they never were implemented. The fly in the ointment was Ukraine. The motivation was clear. They didn't want any part of that. And that's the background to all this. And it was when Minsk really sort of fell apart, it was that when Putin decided, well, we need to finish this thing off. It's not going to be very legal, but we're going to do it. Last thing I'll say on that, it's not very legal. There are some folks that say, well, you could explain it. Certainly it's as legal as some of the things the US did. I don't think it's very legal. The other adjective used was unprovoked. It was provoked. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was provoked. And I hope some of what I said earlier this evening will show you that Putin, in my view, is looking out for the national security of his country, does not want to be threatened in the same way that the US felt threatened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Think about it. Soviet missiles right up there next to Florida, okay? That was an existential threat to us. We faced Khrushchev down. We were able to work out a deal where we moved some missiles from Turkey, but we had the sense to avoid the worst. And when John Kennedy was meeting with his chief advisors, he always insisted that our ambassador, Tommy Thompson, who had been in Moscow, would be there. And so what I'm saying here is that he had not only military advisors, he had somebody who knew Khrushchev, who knew Russia almost as well as George Kennan did. Now, what does Biden have? My God. It sends sweat up the back of my neck here. He's got no expertise that has any real depth to it. And so I'm afraid that unless the military is able to prevail as it has so far and say, look, Mr. Biden, we're not prepared for a two-front war with China getting in this thing. These hotheads, Blinken, Sullivan and the others, and the economic advisors, I just wish better for Biden, because I think he's got enough experience to know how dangerous it would be to provoke Putin into being in such a corner that he might actually think of using small nuclear weapons. There's no, nuclear weapons. So again, I'm talking too much, but I hope that helps.
Very, very interesting. And I want to thank you again for speaking tonight. We are out of time, but appreciate your being here, and I thank all those who participated. So we'll keep in touch and see how this goes. I hope that we can have a ceasefire, as you suggest, and maybe stop some of this madness.
It's true.
Thank you very much. So I guess
Most welcome.
we'll leave now, and thank you for your time.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording now.
Thank you.